Hello and welcome to this virtual lecture. This lecture is part of the Royal Air Force Museum's Research Programme lecture series, hosted virtually, live, here on Crowdcast. The museum also hosts lectures in person at its Midlands site and in collaboration with the universities of Lancaster and Wolverhampton. For more information about upcoming lectures, visit the virtual events section of the museum's website or browse our listed lectures on the museum's Crowdcast channel. Today's lecture, delivered by Jack Thorlin, entitled The Numbers Game, How the RAF Revolutionized Military Planning and Maybe Saved the World, will explore the RAF's seminal contribution to the rise of the scientific method in military planning. Make sure to use the Ask a Question button to type out questions throughout the talk for Jack to tackle at the end of the lecture. Now to introduce Jack. Jack is an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C., and an attorney for the U.S. federal government. He began his career as a counsel for Senator John McCain and since then has worked on national security and legal issues for a variety of committees in the Senate and House of Representatives. He has led congressional investigations and oversight of matters ranging from defense procurement to international tax avoidance. His academic work has focused on the intersection of legal and scientific issues, especially in the context of cost-benefit analysis. Among other things, he has written extensively on how courts have reviewed the US government's use of cost-benefit analysis. He received his undergraduate degree in engineering sciences from Harvard University and his JD from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of and contributor to the Harvard National Security Journal. He lives outside Washington, D.C. with his wife and children and two cats. So I'd like to warmly welcome Jack to the screen here. I'm sure you are all very eager to hear the talk. So Jack, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be able to give this presentation specifically to the RAF Museum because it's not often that you can pander so directly to such an important figure in this story. And it's really remarkable when you look back. Now, if you're like me and you're really interested in the history of World War II, you start getting kind of stereotypes of the countries in your mind. You have the Americans have all of the most industry. The British had the top intelligence service, and the Germans have their brilliant generals, etc. What that kind of stereotyping obscures are some of the kind of more subtle differences that really played a massive difference in the war. And the one I want to talk to you today about is planning. Now, at the outset, that might seem kind of strange, right? Every country has smart people in it. And you'd think, well, how can one country be better at another at planning, at learning from combat, at getting better as the war goes on? And it turns out there is actually a really fascinating story of how the Western Allies got so much better at this. And I would start, and we can go to the next slide. I will start at, so what makes planning good in the first place? I submit that it's connection to reality. It's the ability to know objectively what's going on and to get that information to the right decision makers who are willing to act on it. Before World War II and in the Axis countries during World War II, the most effective way to do that was to rely on generals who had expertise, who had seen combat and kind of had their own preconceptions of what worked and what didn't work. The RAF's big innovation was to use the scientific method instead in place of just relying on the experience of generals. They used civilian groups that were explicitly a mix of technical personnel, people who knew how to do things in the real world, how to generate hypotheses, test them out, gather data. That approach was hugely successful for the RAF, so much so that the Americans copied the idea. Thank you very much. And eventually, kind of took on its own life, even outside of military planning, because of how powerful the idea of operations research was. This is still important today, and the reason I really wanted to talk about this, because defense intellectuals, as they came to be known, these civilians who would study defense matters, got a bad name in the 1960s. The famous film Dr. Strangelove really portrays this most clearly. There's kind of an egghead scientist who is really bloodthirsty and works with a general to basically start a nuclear war because as long as there's 2 Americans and 1 Russian alive at the end of it, it's a victory. My big goal for this lecture is to show to you that the operations research approach was vital in World War II, but it also really helped Western leaders make key decisions in the Cold War that averted nuclear holocaust. Now, that's enough of a goal, but my stretch goal is to show you that operations research isn't just a military planning thing. It's truly a revolutionary way to study problems, and frankly, we should all be trying to emulate it whenever we can. So if we go on to the next slide, let's start the story. I always think when there's some big new revolution, the question I ask myself is, why didn't people figure this out before? Why was it only in the 1930s, and why just the RAF that figured this out? Well, as I said before, you would rely a lot on the experience of military personnel, and that's a kind of empiricism. They're going off of their experience. But that produces a really kind of insular method of thinking. And I have Sun Tzu up there to represent, he wrote The Art of War, not the science of war. They kind of intuited what the right strategy was on the basis of a wealth of, their whole lifetime of experience. The problem was, even if a country in the pre-modern era wanted to use an operations research approach, they didn't have the state capacity. And that's what sad King John there at the bottom is sad about. It turns out in the past, if you had the wealth to hire educated people to collect data and try to do something like the scientific method, you would usually use that for tax administration, because what the kings wanted really immediately was money. Now, that's the number one reason that they couldn't do it. It was very difficult to do this in the past. Another big problem was gathering data. In the past, Hollywood notwithstanding, there weren't really a lot of large battles going on all the time where you could collect data. You'd have kind of like a generational large battle like Agincourt, and then you'd have a lot of siege warfare. And it's very non-standardized, and that's something important for gathering data. If you have in air warfare in the 20th century, if you want to know if a P-51 Mustang is effective against a Bf-109, a German fighter aircraft, you can collect data on that fairly simply. You just go and see, how many 100 encounters, see who wins 100 times. In the past, you don't have that level of standardization. The Battle of Agincourt, for example, as the British viewers will kind of probably well know from textbooks, it turns on a lot of random things. It turns on how tired the French knights were from running across a field. What was the weather like? When was the last time your army ate? How much rest did they have? Even individual units had different weapons, so it's very hard to gather data. It's very hard to make comparisons across units and across time. Now, you might, if you're very, thinking about this carefully, think, well, sure, so you need state capacity, you need the scientific method, and that comes about in about the 1700s. But so why not in, say, World War I was there operations research? Well, this comes to our last point, which is culture. Thomas Edison, who, for American viewers, we all know him as kind of the inventor. Every American school child knows he invented the light bulb, brilliant scientist, whatever. He took it upon himself to advise the US and British navies in World War I, and he studied convoy problems specifically. How do you protect convoys from U-boat attacks? And he actually had some important insights that would be implemented in World War II. But at the time, he presented his findings to the Navy. The Navy thanked him. Thank you very much, Thomas Edison, and then ignored them. Didn't do anything with them. And the reason was, at that time, there still was this cultural gap between civilians and the military. The military was not about to listen to even an august civilian like Thomas Edison, except in very narrow technical matters. And that's where you're starting to see more involvement in civilians in World War I. I mean, civilians are the ones who know how to make poison gas, who are working on, technological breakthroughs. And that, to preview the next slide, is going to be where the RAF jumps into this picture. So if we go to the next slide, the RAF comes into this story in a frankly somewhat unique place in the interwar period. They were one of the few independent air forces in the world at that time, which is, already gives them an advantage. It means that they're not beholden to kind of fuddy-duddy old generals who are in charge of the armies, where they are basically everywhere else, and they're making, they might not be open to new ways of doing things, or at least as open as the RAF was. The other big thing happening at the time was the rise in theorizing that you could have strategic bombing win a war for you. There were a number of influential advocates across Europe and the United States who were pushing this idea. But really, the UK and the US are the ones who kind of honed in on it. And then that's not a coincidence, right? I mean, you can just look at a map and see why the US and the UK would be more interested in strategic bombing. They're the ones who have at least some chance of not having to refight World War I on the mainland of continental Europe. If they can have some technological solution, if they can have an aircraft solution to the problem of armed conflict on the mainland, they don't have to send, you don't have to send the Tommies back to fight in Flanders again. So the US and the UK are the ones who have really bought into this. The Continental Air Forces are almost entirely devoted to ground support. They are working hand in glove with their armies that have all of the cultural cachet and all of the real control over decision making. So in this context, you can see why the rise of the Luftwaffe in the German Air Force in the 1930s is such a scary thing for Britain, especially. In 1934, Hitler gives a kind of influential speech where he says, the Luftwaffe is now surpassed the RAF in strength, and soon it will be as strong as the French Air Force, which, as things played out, is kind of a weird comparison point. But at the time, it's very scary because you already think that independent air power can win a war, and now the Luftwaffe is stronger than you are. So that triggered a really like a crash effort on the part of the British government, the Ministry of Defense, and the RAF to figure out new ways to counter air power. The problem that interwar theorists had figured out was a bomber can come from anywhere on the compass. And if you were clever enough, you could have them all converge on the same target at the same time. And the famous phrase, the bomber will always get through, it simply means it's very hard to marshal defenses when your enemy can come at you in any direction without any warning. So the key problem that the British government thought they could solve was, let's have warning, and then we can marshal the defenses that we need to stop bombers coming in. They formed a committee called the Tizard Committee after Professor Tizard of Cambridge University, who was an influential scientist at the time working on radar and related problems. At the beginning, there were a lot of kind of failed half-start efforts on ideas that didn't really pan out. Most notably, they tried to, you can find goofy pictures of people with giant headphones trying to come up with a system where you could hear bombers coming from across the English Channel. There was brief work on a death ray that would ostensibly destroy or kill a bomber or a pilot. Now, very close in concept to a death ray is radar, and that's obviously the thing they actually figured out. Now, radar at this time is really not there's kind of a stereotype of the Battle of Britain where radar wins it for them, and it's this magic British weapon that nobody else, could even countenance, even understand. That's really a misconception. The Germans had radar at the time, and it was even superior radar. But what they didn't have was this an approach to how to use radar effectively, because it's actually a complicated problem. And this is where operations research came in. And the civilians had kind of been led in the front door because of the technical aspect of radar, because you need these scientists working on improving the radar. But it turns out to actually use it effectively, you need to have it. It's kind of almost a mathematical problem. The radar has about a 33-mile, 50-kilometer range at the time, and a German bomber can cover that in about 8 minutes. So the question is, how do you arrange, where do you put air bases, where do you put the radars, where do you put ground observers to maximize your ability to feed information to the right place and get defenses to the right place with 8 minutes warning, basically. And the scientists study this problem in a very mathematical way, and they come up with really solutions that were fantastically successful. There's nothing else like it in the world at the time. When the Germans start getting bombed later in the war, they don't perform anywhere near as well. Now, back at 1940, another thing that's going on is the British are trying to entice the United States to enter the war, or if not enter the war, to be more supportive, to give more aid to the UK. And one of the ways they did that was through technical missions and the kind of enticing, if you help us, we'll help you. We have radar. Do you want radar? So they sent Professor Tizard to the United States, literally to deliver a radar. And the US sent a technical mission back. It was led by a Harvard law professor. And he was absolutely blown away by the operations research concept and how well it worked. He came back to Washington and told them, you need to get on this immediately. The US directly copied the idea. Now, the fact that he's a Harvard law professor is worthy of a little bit of diversion, especially because I'm a lawyer and a law professor. I like to talk about the law aspect of this. Lawyers were everywhere in the U.S. effort during the operations research effort during the war. In fact, a future Supreme Court Justice, John Harlan, was the head of Army Air Force operations research. Now, there's two explanations for why there were so many lawyers involved in the U.S. There's a flattering one for lawyers, and I'm sure that's the truth, or there's a not flattering one for lawyers. But I'll tell you both because I'm objective. The flattering one for lawyers is that there was a long history of British attorneys who were kind of tasked with breaking down technical subjects for a lay audience or for policymakers or what have you. And it's because lawyers, if there's a kind of murder case that turns on a technical subject, they have to be able to explain to a jury, how does a car engine work, things like that. So that's kind of flattering to lawyers to think that we're the ones who know how to explain things. The not flattering version is that when the U.S. asked the British how they staffed these committees, the British said, well, we have, it's not just scientists, it's engineers, it's people who know how the aircraft are built. It's all sorts of people. You need anybody who can really work practically in the real world. So you need everyone except lawyers. The U.S. team allegedly misheard this and said, "Oh, they think we should have lawyers in charge." So, oh well. Now, and we can go to the next slide. I would love nothing more than to have an entire lecture that's just the cool stories of operations research and how they figured out these subtle things that changed the war. But that would take all of our time, and I have a bigger agenda. So I'm just going to give you a couple of stories that I think are representative. Now, the first one has to do with anti-submarine efforts by aircraft. So at the time, the main way that aircraft could destroy a submarine was with a depth charge. And if you're not familiar, it's pretty simple. It's just a bomb. You set what depth you want it to detonate at, and boom, it detonates at that depth. At the beginning of the war, the Royal Navy had kind of calculated out what depth you should set for these charges for, based on a pretty logical approach. They had calculated that it takes about 2 minutes from the time an aircraft detects a submarine, a U-boat, till the time it can actually attack. And in that time, a U-boat on average can dive 100 feet deep. So they set the fuses to 100 feet. And it turned out they were getting basically no kills. They were not destroying many submarines this way. They tasked the operations research team to figure out why and to figure out what can you do to improve that. Well, the operations research team realized that the military had been kind of asking the wrong question. The question wasn't where are the U-boats and therefore you should aim there. It's where can depth charges do the most damage. And it turns out that if you set it for 20 feet, and they tested various alternatives, that's part of the scientific method. They set it at 20 feet, and while the average U-boat can go down to 100, if it's at 100 feet, it's turning, you're probably not going to hit it right on the mark. If it's at 20 feet, the bomb's going to detonate pretty quickly, and a large number of U-boats that didn't make it to 100 feet. And remember, if the average is 100 feet, roughly half of them aren't making it that far, you're getting massive damage because they don't have time to turn. They're pretty close to where the bomb is going off. And this change alone led to a 400 to 700% increase in the effectiveness of air attacks on submarines. That's a huge, night and day difference. German intelligence thought the British had come up with a new explosive because there was such an overnight change in how effective these operations were. And that's kind of a classic operations research story. If you can go to the next slide, we have kind of another similar story that I'll kind of go through quickly, which is simply the color on the bottom of anti-submarine aircraft. Originally, at the start of the war, it was black. And again, that's kind of, it makes sense in the military context. You probably wear black for night operations on land, things like that. In the anti-submarine context, though, if you changed the operations research people ran a test where they changed it to white, and in a very deliberate experiment, they found you could get 20% closer to U-boats before detection if the planes were painted white on the bottom. And it kind of makes sense, actually, when you really stop and think about it. At night, something black going in front of the moon, you can see. If it's going in front of stars, you can see it. If it's painted white during the day, you really don't see it. It looks kind of like a cloud. It's not clashing as much with the background. That led to so they get 20% closer to U-boats before detection, and that led to a 30% increased effectiveness of air attacks. And if we go to the next slide, I'll give you one more, which is bombing accuracy. Now, this one it makes a huge difference, just the math of it. 400% increase in accuracy over the course of the war. And there are other things going into this, but that's 250 bombers doing the damage of 1,000 earlier in the war. When you start kind of building that out, how many people difference, how many fewer people have to risk their lives in order to carry out an equally effective raid? It makes a huge difference. How did operations research figure this out? Well, this one wasn't one breakthrough. It was a bunch of smaller breakthroughs. One of which was having everyone bomb based on the lead bombardier, because it turned out Individual bombardiers weren't doing a great job. They would miss the target by miles in some cases. But if everybody drops at the time when an expert bombardier tells them to drop, you get good coverage over the area you're trying to hit, and that leads to a great increase in effectiveness rather than having everybody kind of make their own mistakes. Another solution, a lot of planes were just flat out going to the wrong cities. Early in the war, there's all these shocking statistics about how few bombs, something like 15% of bombs are landing within like 5 miles of the aim point. It's really shockingly bad statistics early in the war. Another solution for that problem is radar guides that would help the planes get to the right city. Seems like kind of a basic thing. Another solution that operations research came up with was having larger bomb group sizes, because they crunched the data and it turned out bomber losses stayed roughly the same, without regard for how large the number of bombers in the attack were. So, if you have 250 bombers and you're going to lose 10 of them, or you're going to have 1,000 bombers and you're going to lose 10 of them, you should do 1,000 every time because it's a smaller percentage of overall bombers. A similar calculation was made for convoy sizes, led to a 1/3 decrease in the number of convoy ships being sunk. Another huge difference from a really simple concept that it's deceptively simple. The military might not have even really looked at that, but an outsider applying the scientific method can figure it out. If we go to the next slide, so those are some examples of operations research successes. What I'd like to talk about a little bit also is, so why didn't the Axis copy this idea? If it's working so well, you'd think that they have equally smart people. Why can't they do it? It turns out this is something that's almost a unique advantage of the Western Allies. Because it's not just contingent on having intelligent people. It's contingent on having a military that's open to communication with civilians, and leaders who are willing to put in place the policies on the basis of outside scientific method input from civilians. So there are kind of different reasons why Germany and Japan couldn't do this themselves. Germany had obviously an extreme cultural superiority of the military, and that is largely due to Nazism, but it's not entirely just due to Nazism. The Germans at the time were very regimented. When they wanted input from civilians, they conscripted them. And that's kind of a subtle problem, but what it means is that if you're a scientist trying to advise the German military to do something, you're going to become a private when they conscript you. You're going to have a very low rank, and then the Germans, who are very order bound, generals be like, why would I listen to a private? So there's kind of a self-defeating aspect there. Fascist leadership was also pretty disconnected from reality to begin with, which made it very hard to get new ideas in front of them in organized fashion. The most senior Luftwaffe officer at Hitler's headquarters for most of the war was like a lieutenant or captain, I can never remember which, very low ranking. So fresh ideas from the Air Force basically didn't have a chance of getting there. And also fascism is kind of prone to appointing cronies and yes men, because there's this constant fear that the leader might be supplanted in some way by an effective person that's appointed under them. That's what Hermann Goering, the head of the German Air Force at the time, that was his problem. He had been appointed because he was a leader in World War I, kind of a hero, an ardent Nazi, but he wasn't a competent manager at all. And he was worried that if he had a competent manager help him, then that person would become the new head of the Luftwaffe, because Hitler would sack Goering and appoint this competent person. So there's this constant disconnection from reality, this not wanting to get closer to reality for internal political reasons. There's also, of course, prioritization of miracle weapons over incremental improvements. So, the V1, the V2, they're devoting a lot of scientific resources to this and not a lot of scientific resources to studying how the military is doing. Japan has slightly different problems, some of the same. They had their cultural superiority to the military as well, but they also had a really shocking inter-service rivalry. And if you haven't studied the period, it's really almost impossible to imagine in our modern context. The Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy hated each other, so much so that they often didn't want to consult with civilians outside, because they were worried that the consultations would get to the other service. And then they might use it in their own internal political machinations to steal resources from the army or steal resources from the Navy. So really just a shocking level of inter-service rivalry. They also had limited interaction between military and civilians, in part because they had really decentralized industry. they were, if your image of the war is the Ford factory plant that's, turned from making cars to making bombers, in Japan, it's really much more of a workshop thing, like small workshops. And part of the problem there is that you don't have the institutional heft to have, the technical people interjecting to the military and advising them to do certain things. And the average, Japanese officer, they've been fighting in China for years before World War II even started. They're kind of career military people who are not used to listening to civilians. By contrast, among the Western countries, most of the officer corps were civilians before the war, and they came from, from a capitalist framework where they were working with industry. They, in some cases, were working in industry directly. So it was really a very small hurdle for them to say, okay, we'll reach back out to the scientists now. So that's kind of why the Axis didn't jump on this bandwagon. So we can go to the next slide. I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture of operations research in World War II. For it is a revolution and it makes a huge difference to the war, but there were limits to it. And the main one is that operations research was used for tactics and operations, but not strategy. And a quick refresher: tactics are kind of how soldiers fight. If the classic, the enemy's on that hill. How do we take that hill? Really ground level. What depth should a depth charge detonate at? That's a classic tactical granular question. Operations are kind of the next level up, and it's kind of usually thought of as more, how do you get the soldiers to the best place where they can make a decisive difference? That's kind of your arrows on the map sort of thing. And strategy is big picture questions. What should we do, and what resources should we use to accomplish the objectives that we set? Now, these definitions, military historians really, and current military people can really get into the weeds on what's tactics versus operations. But the big picture point is that the strategy level, the big picture strategic decisions in World War II depended a lot more on politics and personnel than they did on any sort of objective analysis, and certainly operations research kind of analysis. This is a topic that would warrant its own lecture also, but I'm going to quickly just give an example so you can get a flavor of the kind of politics I'm talking about. Anyone who studied the strategic bombing campaigns quickly encounters this weird dichotomy where the British and American forces had two completely different theories of strategic bombing that weren't logically working together at all, really. The British had decided that they wanted to do area bombing at night because bombing in the daytime is dangerous. Precision bombing seemed quite ineffective. There was a whole theory that, okay, well, what if you could just dehouse industrial workers? If they are losing their homes, they're not going to be effective workers in the munitions industries that are key to the war, things like that. The Americans have almost exactly the opposite theory. They think area bombing is ineffective. Precision bombing works really well. And also they did offer some moral objections to area bombing, like it's immoral that you're going to be, you could think of this as targeting civilians. I don't want to get into that debate. The RAF Museum had a fascinating lecture on Bomber Harris, Arthur Harris, that kind of encountered some of these issues. I highly recommend that discussion. I think it's interesting that these decisions were not made on the basis of really hard data. Because if they were, the British and American staffs, the operations research staffs who work together all the time, could have really just combined their efforts and figured out what works. Area bombing, precision bombing. But key personnel on both sides were making decisions that really guided policy. I mentioned Arthur Bomber Harris, obviously famous to the British audience. And I don't want to wade into, there's also a lot of debate over how, his character, things like that. I don't want to get into that other than to say he's, for either his supporters or detractors, he was a bellicose figure. This is a man who wanted a public relations effort to announce that his job was to kill Germans so that people would get off his back for killing Germans, for better or worse. On the U.S. side, you had Hap Arnold and Carl Spaatz, who were kind of two interwar leading figures in the idea of precision bombing and strategic bombing. So lo and behold, when they got to the European theater, they said, this is a time for precision bombing. So what analysis did the two sides actually do? Well, the UK was guided in large part by analyzing German efforts during the Blitz. They saw what worked and what didn't, because it's hard to know when you're bombing another country what effect it's having. But if you're being bombed, you know exactly how effective different bombing tactics are. Now, the problem, if there was a problem with this approach, it's that technology is changing a bit, and what the Germans did and their failures were not necessarily determinative of what British bombers would have to do. The U.S. was guided, and actually just one other note on the U.K. front. Clearly, the experience of the Blitz affected planning in multiple ways, and some of it was more emotional than that. When the British planners were calculating how many German civilians would die in a bombing raid, they would calculate it in units of Coventries. Coventry, obviously, the British audience will be more familiar with this, was the site of the most horrific German bombing of civilians. 554 died. So they would say, well, if we bomb Hamburg, there'll be 4 Coventries. I think it's impossible to look at that sort of thing and think that's not weighing on this decision that we should be targeting civilians. Targeting civilians. I don't want to get into semantics. The U.S. side of this was guided because at the beginning of the war, they did some test runs of precision bombing and found that it works great if you take a small force and you're attacking a small target, and the German air defenses aren't really reacting, and there's perfect weather, and if everything's completely perfect, precision bombing works really well. Well, they did that a couple times at the beginning of the war. It worked, and they decided we're going to do this for the entire war. And that decision came with a lot of ramifications. There were really horrific losses in the American bomber forces in 1943, especially from this decision to proceed with precision bombing. As a final coda to this, the idea that area bombing is immoral, which was a common hobby horse in Europe, didn't affect American operations in the Pacific at all, showing just how much personnel mattered in these decisions. Curtis LeMay in the Pacific Theater famously, on the advice of operations research people, switched his tactics to firebombing, leading to the deadliest air attacks in human history. Like the Tokyo firebombing killed 90,000, 100,000 people. So all that to say, this is all just a prelude to say, at the strategic level, politics are guiding things, personnel are guiding things. And really justifying the two completely different campaigns, in some ways, it was helpful for appeasing Stalin because it convinced the Soviets, they're bombing, they're working hard at strategic bombing, even if the effectiveness is debatable. And there were talking points guiding kind of the main leaders also. Churchill in particular was trying to convince the Americans to go over to area bombing, but was eventually kind of persuaded by the talking point that bombing Germany in these two different ways meant that you were bombing them around the clock. Having worked in Washington and in Congress, that's kind of a very talky point approach. Like, it sounds good, but when you stop and think about it, like, what is that really? Why do we care if it's around the clock if it works better to do it one way or the other? So all that to say, the big thing that was going to change after the war was that operations research was going to start taking on strategic issues. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see how that happened. It starts with General Hap Arnold, who I just mentioned, an American general. He was 55 when the war started. So he was very much in legacy mode towards the end of the war. And what he really didn't want to see was the dissipation of talent that he had seen after World War I, where civilians kind of go back to being civilians, and the military kind of returns to this hidebound status, and et cetera. So he took $10 million left over from the war and formed and started a contract, which eventually created the RAND Corporation. If you're familiar with the history of nuclear war and nuclear strategy and all that, the RAND Corporation is very famous for that. And if you're not, I'll give you a quick primer on that. So it was the original think tank, fantastic place to work. It was awash in cash from lucrative defense contracts. It had access to policymakers. So you, as an academic, can directly change. You are talking to the decision makers who are going to change policy. You had almost total academic freedom to study this really interesting new problem of nuclear war. You were surrounded by brilliant people. It's almost hard to imagine now, but you had some of the most brilliant people, not just of the time, but of human history. Specifically, John von Neumann, if you ever want to go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole, is just an unbelievably brilliant person. Allegedly hired as a RAND consultant just to write down errant thoughts he had while shaving, which is funny, but it turns out it paid off hugely. He was seminal in the field of game theory, which you may have heard of. It would absolutely change the world, and it's something that he pioneered, and then Rand took the baton for after the war. It's worth also noting the Soviets had absolutely nothing like Rand, for the same reason that the Axis didn't. They didn't want independent thought. They had strict hierarchies. Stalin was not a fan of an independent group of civilians advising the military. Now, if we go on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about, so RAND, remember, coming straight from this operations research paradigm, from World War II, that pioneered by the RAF. One of their first taskings was, we want you to design the optimal bomber for penetrating Soviet air defenses. And RAND had these brilliant people think about it, and they came up with a solution. Saturate Soviet air defenses with cheap turboprop planes. You're going to send thousands of cheap propeller planes at the Soviet air defenses, and they'll, kill a couple hundred pilots, a couple hundred planes, but everybody else is going to get through, and their full nuclear bomb load is going to get through. The Air Force hated this, hated this idea, and for partly for very parochial reasons. Senior Air Force leadership were pilots during World War II. It's absolutely not flattering to say, well, your job in the next war is going to be fly straight into air defenses and get mowed down so that others can get through. It also meant no cool new jet bombers. It meant just making kind of boring old planes that would get knocked out of the sky. So the Air Force rejected this plan, but it really starts to help RAND because it forces them to diversify their clientele. No longer, they're so worried that they've offended the Air Force, they start working this idea into civilian context, and cost-benefit analysis starts working into civilian context. Specifically, the Air Force objected that they weren't calculating the value of a life of a pilot in their calculations of cost-benefit analysis. So RAND took that to heart, started calculating the value of human lives, and that idea ended up becoming the center, basically, of cost-benefit analysis for environmental regulations, for example, which is how lawyers like me get involved. So at the time, it's worth it to contrast RAND's approach with what the military was doing at this time. And now we can go back to our buddy, Curtis LeMay. He was a big proponent of what's called the Sunday Punch. The idea was launch all of our nuclear weapons immediately, wipe out the Soviet Union, not just the Soviet Union, Communist China, all of the satellite countries in one big attack, all done. Now, I bring up LeMay especially because he's really the kind of pre-World War II heroic general figure. He was a lead from the front guy. His men loved him. He is the kind of guy who would have this experience to guide planning. And he had some biases built into that. He really believed in striking hard and winning the war the first hour, basically. Now, Curtis LeMay, I have all sorts of stories about him, and frankly, I don't want to, for time purposes, I can't tell you all of them. If you want to hear more, ask a question about it. He described himself as, I would have been a war criminal if the Japanese had won. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara said that he was a brutal person. His protege, and maybe it's not fair to hold his protege's words against him, when Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was briefed on the Sunday Punch plan, he asked, well, why would we destroy Albania, for example? Albania had like 100 nuclear weapons devoted to its utter destruction because the Soviets had some parts of the year plan to land bombers there after they had delivered their nuclear payloads. So they were going to destroy Albania on that basis. And McNamara asked, well, so doesn't that seem excessive? And LeMay's protege basically says in the meeting, well, it sounds like the defense secretary must have some friends in Albania if he's got such a big problem with us destroying Albania for basically no reason. I give that as color to show the Air Force has their parochial interests. They want to have a big attack all at once because that means you need to have a big bomber fleet to do it. There was a big inter-service rivalry at the time, too. The Navy in the late 40s was worried that Air Force bombers were going to take over basically all military spending. And where would the aircraft carriers be? So a bunch of admirals in what's called the Revolt of the Admirals went to Congress and testified, contrary to what the administration wanted them to say, that nuclear weapons are barbaric, immoral, un-American. We shouldn't have them. We shouldn't be using them. We shouldn't even think about using them. Now, 10 years later, the Navy develops the Polaris missile, which is inaccurate and can only really hit cities. And that leads the Navy to change their tune from they're barbaric to we should only target cities. And then they come up with some talking points about, well, that means you only need a small deterrent force. You can put them all in submarines. It'll work great. Now, RAND's counter to all this is really important. And it especially is important in the context of the times. After the Korean War, when President Eisenhower came into power, he changed U.S. doctrine to the massive retaliation theory, where you're not going to fight bloody wars like Korea anymore. You're going to be focused much more on if the Soviets do one thing wrong, suddenly they start invading West Germany, boom, full nuclear attack, Sunday Punch, the whole thing. Rand developing game theory turns out to be very important for this story because game theory changes the calculus of how you should even look at nuclear war. Soviet cities are the last thing you want to target. That's what Rand figured out. Because once you target a Soviet city, once you wipe out Soviet cities, there's absolutely no reason for them not to wipe out the West, to wipe out American cities, European cities, the whole thing. What you want to do is instead what's called counterforce strategy. You want to target Soviet weapons because then if you can get rid of their weapons, then you can dictate the terms of peace to them. But also you can hold their cities hostage. You can say, if the war keeps going, we are going to target cities next. And it provides US presidents and leaders around the world a chance to de-escalate, a chance to avoid having nuclear war and civilization itself. This is going to be very important in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we can go to the next slide and start talking about that. One of the big problems Rand identified with the massive retaliation plan is, well, how do you credibly tell allies, we're going to start a nuclear war that's going to result in the destruction of New York and all of the major American cities. We're going to be willing to do that. Even if for like the smallest transgression. We will go to nuclear war to save West Germany, to save Paris, for example, and we'll sacrifice New York. Allies won't really believe that, and they probably will defect away from you because they don't trust you. One of the solutions at the time was to give allies more of a say in nuclear planning, including basing nuclear weapons on their territory. This was part of the reason why in the 50s, in the Eisenhower administration, he authorized the deployment of nuclear weapons to Turkey. And specifically, some medium-range missiles, inaccurate, not helpful at all from a counterforce perspective. All they can do is hit cities. It turns out Khrushchev sees this deployment and is frankly, understandably concerned about it because it doesn't really serve much of a function other than you could take out Moscow pretty quickly. It also, by the way, side note, Rand also figured out it's not really helpful. I see 5 minutes. Thank you. It's not really helpful to have a kind of first strike capability against cities because if you take out Moscow, for example, you're not going to have someone to negotiate with to de-escalate things. If someone's still in charge, it'll be the military, and they will just launch all their weapons at back. That's the end of everything. So there's kind of this misconception that, if only you could sneak a nuclear weapon to take out Washington or Moscow, then you could win the war. That's not how it works. And that's another contribution Rand had to the general debate. So you put these missiles in Turkey. Khrushchev decides, I'm going to put missiles in Cuba so that I will have the same kind of leverage and the same, similar weapon system, actually. It couldn't take out U.S. weapons. It could only take out U.S. cities. This provokes the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's also a great RAF Museum presentation about that. Happy to recommend it. Kennedy, who's taken power in 1961, is in charge for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he's a big devotee of a more flexible response, the kind of Rand-driven counter to massive retaliation, which is you need to be focusing on counterforce. You need to be thinking about limited escalation, not just saying you're going to go with the Sunday punch option. And that is the key to understanding how the crisis was resolved peacefully. Because ultimately, Kennedy traded the Turkish missiles for the Cuban missiles. Because there were 15 medium-range missiles in Turkey were completely irrelevant from a strategic perspective for the U.S. And you can understand why. It wasn't our plan anymore to target cities right away. It wasn't our plan to target Moscow right away. None of that made any sense. So you're basically giving away something that doesn't matter for the opportunity to have continued peace. Now, if you're approaching this from the more Curtis LeMay standpoint, this was an unprincipled swap. This was, the Soviets did this aggressive thing, and why are we rewarding them by removing the Turkish missiles? LeMay was very much of the opinion you should bomb the missiles, and if the Soviets have a problem with that, you should bomb the Soviets. And that sort of thinking was explicitly rejected in the crisis, and to all of our ultimate benefits. So let's go to the next slide and go to some quick conclusions because we've covered a lot. I want to leave you with a couple conclusions that are kind of increasing complexity. Now, this first one is something you can just tell at a cocktail party pretty simply. Operations research is a hidden advantage in World War II. That was absolutely crucial, and it was absolutely something that could only happen among the Western Allies. When the RAF came up with it for a variety of reasons, it was something that The Axis couldn't copy because you needed to have a pro-science, pro-industry culture within a democratic system of government. You couldn't have a fascist country in a real operations research approach. The next level up in complexity, we can go to the next slide. Operations research really unlocked a new approach to problem solving that really contradicted the vast majority of human history. I've got the Portrait of Napoleon by David here as the example of heroic genius. And you really, after World War II and after the success of operations research, it's not tenable at all really to talk about military genius anymore as being sufficient to win a war. And we have a lot of carryover to our modern day of people talking about, an individual genius being able to shape a military conflict. It's kind of a myth now. Operations research is the absolute opposite of David's Portrait of Napoleon. Operations research is about boring committees, boring data collection, but it's absolutely deadly, cannot be countered. No one's figured out a better way to do it. And finally, we go to the final slide. Connecting to reality through data is the best way to solve problems, especially as things become more and more complicated. As the world becomes more complicated, as military problems become more complicated, you need to have a scientific approach because experience quickly devalues as things evolve and change. For example, if you were a major military leader today, right, you were probably an officer during the young officer during the Gulf War. The Gulf War is radically different from modern wars, from what's going on in Ukraine, things like that. You need to have a data-driven approach to solve these hard problems in the face of complexity. And I picked this picture for it because I think it really conveys. You look at the immaculately dressed. This is the surrender of the Japanese on the USS Missouri at the end of World War II. Immaculately dressed Japanese soldiers and their leaders in top hats, and the American officers look like they basically just woke up. And it's symbolizing. The New World is not about having a heroic general. It's about being able to approach problems rationally and listen to and use a scientific method rather than going from intuition. And a concluding story about Dr. Strangelove. It has a famous conversation in it where the kind of Rand type caricature is talking about caves and how the US can get an advantage over the Soviets if the last 100 people have better caves in the United States than there are in the Soviet Union. This was actually based on a real life conversation, but in the movie, it's portrayed as the Rand researcher and the general kind of both saying yeah, we need to get these caves and then we can attack the Russians and it'll be great. What actually happened in real life was the Rand researcher was arguing against Curtis LeMay's second in command, who was frustrated with the idea of counterforce, was frustrated with the idea that you should not try to kill every Soviet the second war starts. And he famously said, and I wrote down the direct quote, "Restraint, why are you so concerned with saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards. Look, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win." And I think what I want to leave you with is the idea that the scientific approach is the opposite of that. And that's what's going to be a moderating influence in both throughout the Cold War and really something we should take away for our own use in going forward. And with that, happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Jack. That was a very interesting talk, which has left me, and I'm sure many others in attendance today, with quite a lot to think about. And we've already got quite a few of them, quite a lot of questions. So thanks again, Jack. Before we dive into our Q&A, I just wanted to quickly highlight for our audience our current drive to save the Arthur Scarfe Victoria Cross Medal. So Arthur Scarfe was a recipient of the only Victoria Cross awarded to the Royal Air Force during the fighting in the Far East in the Second World War. This medal has been sold at auction, but we've been given an opportunity to fundraise and match the sale price. This will allow the Royal Air Force Museum to display the medal and share Arthur's amazing story. We need your support to raise about £250,000. It's a lot, I know, but by the 30th of April 2023. We've already had loads of great donations, which we're very thankful for. But without your help, this medal will be sent overseas and lost to the nation. So if you follow the Save Arthur Scarfe VC button at the bottom of the screen, highlighted in turquoise, that'll take you to our GoFundMe page. If you want to find more information, you can find it on our website. But yeah, I think we can kick it off with the Q&A. And I've already seen we've got quite a lot of questions already, which is fantastic to see. So I'm going to put Jack on screen so you can all see him answer these questions deftly. So I think we'll start with Mark Tuffield's question. So Mark asks, was the American system more bureaucratic than the British? And he says, thinking of problems the Navy Bureau of Ordnance had with its torpedoes and the empire building of people like Nichols at the AAF Materiel Command. So,
yeah, I think this is a really good question, and I think this is part of you know, as effective as operations research can be, it is dependent on how much the person in charge wants to listen to it. And weirdly, as much as I've been kind of trashing Curtis LeMay in this talk, he was actually really good at listening to operations research people during World War II. It's often portrayed in the histories as if he came up with the idea of firebombing Japan, and he came up with the idea of stripping B-29s of all of their armor and their weapons in order to do low-level attacks. These were ideas that were come up with by his operations research team. Now, he had the courage to put them in place, and all more power to him. What I take from that, and going back to your specific question, the American system really did depend on, and really honestly, both systems did depend on the general in command really listening. I think the British had the advantage of an independent RAF. They were really, especially fighter command, came out so heavily from the operations research period of the 30s, and their conduct throughout the war, I think, really was pretty exemplary at taking operations research into account. One of the stories that I had to cut was, you may be familiar with the story of the French on May 15th, 1940, were requesting British fighter support, additional British fighters. And they're quickly, they said, we need 10 squadrons or France is going to fall. Churchill was immediately inclined to say yes. But he tasked Hugh Dowding, the head of fighter command, with figuring out how many squadrons can we actually stand to lose. Hugh Dowding turned around and assigned it immediately to his operations research team, and they came back and told him, we need 52 squadrons to defend the British Islands. It's at 36 right now. You cannot keep giving them away. They came up with a bunch of very authoritative tables and graphs. The War Cabinet met the next day, and Churchill went into the meeting thinking he was going to say yes, and he left it deciding that he would say no. Eventually, he did go to Paris and promised 6 squadrons, and he conditioned it on you could keep them in northern France. They'd fly back every night. But the key point is that a lot of people who were involved in the decision making right there said it may have won the war. It may have saved Britain to listen to operations research and do something that wasn't very heroic. Now, this is kind of a long-winded answer to your question, so I'll wrap it up now. But I do think the American system depended on personnel, but the British had a head start that Bomber Command and Fighter Command were both kind of bought into this idea from the beginning.
Excellent answer. I feel like you've answered the question very well there. So the next question is from Jonathan, no last name given. You mentioned that within the German services rivalry, it prevented effective progress in this field. Were these same rivalries a similar impediment in US-UK services?
So the US-UK services did have bad inter-service rivalries. There's absolutely no denying that, especially if you want just an endless litany of this sort of thing. Look at the Pacific War, especially. The Army, Douglas MacArthur and the Navy, it didn't really make sense to have 2 separate island-hopping campaigns. They did it because MacArthur was famous. That inter-service rivalry was definitely still present. From an operations research perspective, it didn't have a lot of sway at the strategic level, so it wasn't hindering progress through a failure to listen to operations research. The German problem was specifically that you couldn't even get in the front door to make changes to your own service. So the Luftwaffe, Hitler by the end of the war, not even by that late in the war, I think in 43 perhaps, was saying you should just ban the Luftwaffe, have no planes, devoted all to just anti-aircraft defense, 88 millimeter air defenses. That just speaks to the level of, in the German system, they weren't communicating effectively with decision makers. There was no operations research, but even if there had been, no one would have listened to them. So when I say the German inter-service rivalry prevents effective progress, it's because the Army is hidebound and traditional. They didn't want to do operations research. The Luftwaffe might have had more inclination to do it, but they were equally hopeless because no one who had any power was going to listen to them, from Hermann Goering to Hitler. So it's, there is still inter-service rivalry between the US and UK, between the armed forces in the US and UK, but that's more at a strategic level and less from operations research directly.
Yeah, there's a difference in degree of severity, which I think you argued, very well. Kind of this idea that this would have only occurred and can have only occurred among the Allied forces, and that the kind of more brutal fascist and kind of, I think, hyper paranoid nature of Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany prevented that. So yeah, excellent. R. Hewitt asks, how far do you think that the effectiveness of operational research sections varied with the culture of the RAF command to which they were attached? In particular, did Dickens and the Bomber Command ORS go native rather than remaining objective? Blackett and Zuckerman are quite critical in this regard.
So here's what I'll say. First of all, there certainly were different cultures, and that this is kind of a level of granularity where I would be, if that's the problem that you have, you're doing great. Where you're getting into the different level of cultures between Bomber Command, Fighter Command, the other parts of the RAF. Now they did have different cultures, and frankly, I've been talking about the Rand Corporation because I know it very well. That had a different culture from the ORS sections among the British and the Americans. So I do. It's kind of inherent. Think about like Silicon Valley. Everyone has like a Silicon Valley type that they can imagine in their heads. But every company at Silicon Valley has their own specific culture. I would analogize operational research sections to that. They have a broadly similar approach. They're not. They do better or worse. There are definitely better or worse approaches, but the fact that they are even using this approach, that they have this general culture that they're going to be trying it and they're going to be listened to, that's what I think makes a crucial difference more than the actual culture within individual sections.
And I imagine it would, again, the Silicon Valley analogy is interesting because it would also, I would think, increase the effectiveness of operational research to have varying approaches within services. So that kind of difference in effectiveness at different levels encourages kind of that more granular kind of approach. If it was one kind of macro system, that would perhaps be less effective. So Andy Turk asks, connecting to reality through data, as your quote, how will artificial intelligence influence/drive operational research and strategic decision makers as we return to great power competition? That's a very interesting topical question for sure.
So I think what's really interesting, and this kind of goes back to the World War I aspect of the story, I think, because big data and AI are improved ways of handling data and generating data. They're only going to work if leaders listen to them, and they're only going to work if they're accurate modeling. This is kind of the Thomas Edison story again, right? I'll just give a general example. I don't want to get too much into specifics, and as a lawyer, I don't know the modern systems as well. But I will say, if you have a Chinese system, right, a lot of their problems come from not because they don't have enough data. It's because there are political problems when a authoritarian country tries to make objective decisions. You saw this really recently, and just on a slightly off topic, but on COVID for them, right? Like they were on strict zero policy for so long that it was starting to strangle their economy. And they had to keep doing it, though, because it had created like a propaganda value of, see, we're doing so much better than the West because we had these strict rules. So the problem in great power competition, and this is, again, kind of going back to my last answer also, if everybody started using more data, big data approaches, and actually listening to, a kind of scientific method approach, they're doing great. Just being able to have a system where that can happen is the real, hidden sauce here. The hidden ingredient in the special sauce of how the West does this really well is to have a culture where you can have the scientists have meaningful input. Just having the technology is never going to be the unique thing. It's going to be a question of how well you integrate it into actual operations. If the generals aren't listening to operations research insights, if the elected officials aren't listening to operations research insights, it doesn't matter how smart the AI gets, and it doesn't matter how well they handle big data.
Excellent. Jamie asks, did LeMay change his views later, like afterwards?
Yes. After the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, so this is going down a Curtis LeMay rabbit hole. And I honestly, this was the hardest thing for me to cut when I was trying to time out this lecture, because there are just endless interesting stories about Curtis LeMay. I will note that I think he is a textbook example. Famously, Napoleon was kind of may have been going kind of nuts by the time he came back and went to Waterloo and things like that. And I think LeMay was actually kind of similar. He had kind of lived past his prime and when he was actually making good decisions. As a quick LeMay story. Well, first of all, many, even Americans, don't realize this. We had a famous presidential candidate in 1968, George Wallace. He ran as a third-party candidate. he was explicitly pro-segregation, pro-racial segregation. He was kind of a nutcase. He was just a candidate in the South, basically.
Right.
He had Curtis LeMay as his running mate for vice president. And what's really funny about this story is not just that Curtis LeMay wanted to go into politics with this man. George Wallace, who's a segregationist, so he's kind of loony to begin with, and his campaign advisors thought that they were seriously considering kicking Curtis LeMay off the ticket after he was on it because they thought he was too laissez-faire about nuclear war. Too much like, oh yeah, we'll fight it, we'll win it, that'll be great. Maybe we'll lose 50 million people. Small price, who cares? So Curtis LeMay absolutely did not ever change his views. He is a controversial figure. Mm-hmm. I would love to keep going with Curtis LeMay stories, but I'll keep going to next questions. But thank you for the question.
Wonderful. Alexander asks, you said that Stalin didn't want operational planning. Does Putin?
Well, I will say I'm not a friend of Vladimir Putin's. He does not talk to me very often about these things. I will say that the reason, if you present people in the abstract with, there's a brilliant team of scientists that have come up with this recommendation, do you want to hear it? It's very rare that you'll find someone who says no explicitly. Like, I think even Stalin might say yes to that. The problem is that people have vested interests against bringing these recommendations to the fore if they are against their parochial interests. So it's not in the Putin context. I will say completely hypothetically, just based on things I've heard in public and in the media, it's if the defense ministry presents him with news, right? They want to present good news because they want to get promoted. There's this constant aversion to reality, and that's one of the pervasive problems of fascism and of authoritarian governments, right? Like, all you have to do is make Putin happy, and you will have a career. You'll be great. You just have to win him over. So if you can win him over by telling him good news when there's actually bad news, telling him that it's night out when it's daytime, then you're going to do that. And I think that's the same with Stalin. Neither Stalin nor Putin, I'm certain, would say, I don't want to know what's actually going on. But what they do, that's a lot harder to resist, is, you reward people you like, and you like people who tell you good news. And I think that's what you really see with both Putin and Stalin. And Stalin has his own problems. He's also a lunatic. That's another lecture. But that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I think the thing with the interesting thing with Stalin is there's quite a lot of literature on which basically breaks down the Cold War as if it is the product of some kind of underlying extreme anxiety on the part of Stalin. And I think, especially in the Western media, Putin is being increasingly portrayed as that kind of little Stalin with that kind of anxious, kind of fearful nature. And I think you're right. I think the problem that Xi Jinping is having in China right now is that he's done such an immaculate job over the last couple of decades at reducing the amount of competition within his own party, that now there is nobody, once Xi Jinping leaves power, that is able to kind of fill those shoes. And so China is going to have an interesting problem in the next couple of decades with the quality of its leadership. And I think, again, that speaks to your point more generally about the ineffectiveness of authoritarian governments at kind of encouraging operational planning and operational research. Somebody who hasn't got a username, interesting, says, sounds like operations research changed a lot after World War II. So how did it help the Allies win? How much did it help the Allies win? Sorry.
So I would say, as I kind of mentioned, at the strategic level, it's not influencing the big decisions because there's so much politics and personnel involvement. So an interesting question that I thought about talking about also was, would the Allies still have won without operational research? And I think the answer is probably yes, but at key decision points like the Battle of Britain, you start getting into, okay, so if the British performed, say, 40% worse at the Battle of Britain, I don't know. The RAF Museum has had a lot of presentations. It was a close run thing at times. It's really hard to get into counterfactuals. I will say it might not have been the absolute, could the Allies have won without it? Sure. They had tremendous resource advantage. When you look into, the industrial figures for, Germany, Japan, United States, Britain, Soviet Union, it's shocking that Hitler and Japan thought they had even a remote chance of winning. But it might have been far more bloody. And, you never know how these things turn out. If you make the war 40% more costly, for example, do the Soviets sue for a separate peace? Possibly.
Yeah.
Does that keep Hitler in power?
Hmm.
Maybe, or not a full reckoning with the problems of Nazism. Now, I will say it changed a lot after World War II. I think mainly because of the nature of nuclear war. It would have been easy to cabin it off where it had been, which is at the tactical and operational level. But nuclear problems, and Rand really exemplified this, you couldn't really insulate strategic considerations from tactical considerations. The design
Hmm.
of a bomber governs foreign policy, for example.
Hmm.
The U.S. wouldn't, if they had only short-range bombers, for example, you'd have had much. You need to have much stronger relations with all the countries around the
Yeah.
Soviet Union because you have to base them there.
Hmm.
In the nuclear era, you just have to be that much more involved at every level. So that's why it changed, and I do think it helped the Allies win significantly. And it's kind of impossible to answer whether they would have won without it, but
Hmm.
who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point. I mean, there's been quite a lot of lectures that have been delivered, and it has been a lot of the narratives have been like, oh, by the skin of our teeth, by the skin of our teeth. So, if you were to argue that operational research was in any way positive, you have to consider the question that at least at that stage in the war, it might have gone significantly differently. So, yeah, good answer. Um, Mark Edley asks, did the Axis forces cover some of the gap which you discuss by research by technical staff within their military? Is the term operations research purely relative to civilian activities in support of the military? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so I have been using the phrase kind of as a shorthand. That was
Mhm.
the official British term. They had operations research staffs. Now, technically, you can have a military group do this, and then the Axis did have some things like this. The real problem, though, is that it's so hard to get an actual good non-parochial answer out of the military when they're
Mhm.
studying their own problems. And I'm most familiar with this in the context of the U.S. and specifically in nuclear planning. The Air Force at one point, because Rand kept kind of shooting down their ideas and influencing policymakers, they set up their own internal Rand basically.
Mm.
But it didn't have anywhere near the credibility because you didn't have like brilliant scientists. You had smart people there, but you didn't have the same level of
Mhm.
intellectual rigor. Um, and everyone kind of understood that like if you ask an internal question, you're going to get an internal answer.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
Now, and did they come up with some good ideas? Sure. But they weren't as valuable because they weren't an independent voice. And really,
Mhm.
this kind of goes back to the other point about AI. Also, a lot of times the hard thing is not having someone understand, like come up with an idea. It's having the institutional capacity to use the idea
Mhm.
and to have it to recognize that it's a good one. The Axis people on the ground with the Axis, I'm sure they're not dumb. I'm sure they were seeing what was working and what wasn't working. But the problem is, I mean, if Hitler only has a captain at his headquarters, let's say you're like the most brilliant, scientist who's for some reason working for the Luftwaffe, and you realize that you could, repaint a Focke-Wulf 190 and it would suddenly sweep the skies clean.
Mm.
You need to get people to actually listen to you, and Hitler's the only one who can really make that decision, and
Mhm.
he has a captain there who's going to be like overruled immediately.
Mm.
So it's really hard. The hard thing is not so much having a technical staff that knows what to do, it's how to get a situation where the generals will listen to them.
Mhm. Yeah, excellent. Uh, Nisha Singh asks, did this new partnership/relationship between the military and civilians to advance operations research open up opportunities for partnerships between military and civilian/civil society in other areas of military strategy or security cooperation?
Yeah, well, this goes back to just how influential Rand was, and things like cost benefit analysis. I talked a little bit about environmental regulation. I mean, it's hard to find a field that has not been influenced by the ideas that Rand was coming up with in the 60s.
Mm.
And I do think that here's one really concrete example that Americans will immediately understand, but I'll try to explain it so everyone can. Every single bill that goes through Congress has a cost estimate now from the Congressional Budget Office. And it's basically a cost benefit analysis.
Mhm.
If they project what do they think the income is going to be over 10 years, what do they think it's going to cost. That is a direct, it's not perfect, but it is directly from Rand's type of cost benefit
Mhm.
analysis. And that influences everything in the United States. If you've ever seen anything of news coverage about Congress, you know how important CBO scores are. So it's actually really almost eerie when you stop and look at like exactly how pervasive Rand's ideas were and how it opened people's eyes to new ways of thinking, to
Mhm.
new ways of quantifying things. I mean, like I said earlier in the lecture, also, I mean, they came up with the internet. is another just like crazy thing about Rand. I think I may have forgotten to mention this. I may have not gotten to it. I'll just briefly mention again. Because they thought that communication systems in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis might be, vulnerable because they're all centralized, like a phone switchboard. They decided to come up with a decentralized system that where you could warn bases and you could have, if one node gets taken out, you can keep going. That is the internet. That became the internet. So anyway, not to get on too much of a tangent about the internet, but I do think that is just, it's not so much that it opened explicit partnerships as everybody suddenly became, Rand basically took over how everyone thought about everything, and to some extent.
It's interesting that there's that kind of idea of lineage, the idea that these kind of Rand ideas kind of penetrated into broader society, and you can see that lineage. And if following your talk, and I'm sure you've got so much experience with it, you see it is almost eerie because you're like, hang on a second, the people are using this so pervasively across society, and most people have no idea where this came from and the context of where it comes from. I mean, if you ask somebody, where do you think CBO scores came from? You wouldn't think RAF planning in the Second World War. That wouldn't be the genesis point, which is the point of your talk, I suppose, isn't it?
Yes. Well, thank you to the RAF. And then next time you use the internet, say, you know what? It was the RAF that got us.
all take all the credit. So next question: How was operations research adopted into civilian life? So it's a similar question, i.e., management sciences. Was it down to demobilization and personnel moving out of the military? So you did mention this idea of wanting to keep people in the military after conflict, not like after the First World War, where people kind of bled immediately and lost a lot of that kind of learned knowledge and that talent.
Yeah, no, well, as I said earlier, I would love to just do a second lecture that is just stories about operations research and how it percolates into everything. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, I mentioned him. He was a defense secretary in the 60s. Before that, he ran Ford. And he was responsible for a number of innovations. And he was ruthlessly data-driven, analytical, exactly like operations research, directly from the operations research methods that were used in the war, which he was part of. These ideas are, this kind of goes back to the previous answer too. They're so pervasive that when you start looking for them, you see them everywhere. Management sciences is a great segue also. Time management is a thing that the operations research teams came up with as a very granular example. They came up with a better way for soldiers to shave that would save, I believe the number was like 45 seconds or like 1 minute a day, but it was every soldier every day, 1,400 hours over the life of a soldier, like God knows how many years over the life of a unit. These types of decision-making were absolutely what then civilians used in generating more efficient factories and cutting out every last ounce of fat from the production process. And you can see, there were things like that at Ford before the war. Those ideas were out there, but just the extent and just the ruthless data-drivenness of it was it's impossible to say that that's just because of operations research, but it's impossible not to see how it immediately took over.
Yeah. Got time for, I think, one more question before we conclude. T is the username, asks, did the Allies test and refine the techniques they used as the Second World War went on? So, was there this kind of process of constant evolution?
Yes, and that's this is again one of those times where I wish I could just talk about for like 4 hours every example. There are things like the aerial mining of Japanese ports. That was an operations research idea. It was one of the most cost-effective. I saw that it's either upcoming or a previous RAF Museum lecture on this exact topic, and I think it's a great one. It was 5% of the U.S. bomber force was devoted to it, and it basically starved Japan single-handedly. What's interesting about operations research and why it works so well is that it's testing. It's constantly testing. So who knows how many stupid ideas, what colors did they paint the bombers before they got to white? It almost doesn't matter. Like 5 bombers didn't do very well when they were painted pink or something. But the key is that they didn't stick with it. They weren't attached to it. They kept testing and they moved on. So it's easy for me to talk now about all these successes. It's built on a million stupid ideas that didn't work. But that had a low cost. Like if you talk to Silicon Valley people, they'll talk about rapid prototyping. You try something out, it fails immediately, you move on to something else. And yes, the Western, and again, I will note the Western allies were doing this. The Soviets, well, I mean, they improved operations over the course of the war, but they were starting from a pretty low base.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, that I think is kind of all we have time for, but I think we covered a lot of bases. That was a very interesting talk. So I would, I would want to first say thank you to Jack for a fantastic talk. I'm sure the audience feels similarly. We've seen a lot of positive comments in the comment section and lots of great questions, so everyone's clearly very engaged. I would also like to remind our wonderful audience to take a moment to follow our call to action and have a look at the Save the Arthur Scarfe VC fundraiser. We need your help to keep this vital piece of British history here in Britain. So our next lecture, scheduled on the 7th of March at 5:30 p.m. here on Crowdcast, we'll see the University of Nottingham's Professor Bettina Renz ask the question, why did the West overestimate Russian military capabilities, and why does this matter? Right, you can register for this talk now and a range of other talks. So I think that's an interesting one because it kind of takes into the present day a lot of the things that Jack taught us and talked with us today. So thank you very much, Jack, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks a lot. Have a good night.
Bye now, Jack.